Some people spend their whole life living inside a contract they don't remember signing. If you are an INFP or an INTP, that person may be you. There is a soul contract you signed before you understood what a contract was. You did not sign it with a pen. You signed it with your silence, with your disappearance into books, into fantasy, into the architecture of ideas, with the way you stopped asking for certain things, with the way you learned to make unbearable things beautiful, or to understand them so completely that you never had to feel them. You were not forced. That is the hardest part. Nobody held you down and demanded your signature. The family simply created a climate, and you, being who you are, being as sensitive and as intelligent as you are, adapted to it with genius. You found a way to survive, and the way you found worked. That is why the contract is still running today. Not because you are weak, because you were brilliant, because the coping mechanism was so elegant, so invisible, so deeply woven into what you call your personality, that you never noticed it stop being a survival tool and start being a cage. This video is about that contract, the one the INFP made with meaning, the one the INTP made with understanding, and what it costs and what it gives back to finally break it. Every family has a visible story and a hidden climate. The visible story is the one told at dinners, repeated in photographs, summarized in the sentences your family uses to describe itself. The hidden climate is something different. It is the emotional temperature you learned to read before you had words for it. The thing that taught you which feelings were safe, which truths created danger, and which parts of yourself needed to be kept out of sight to preserve the peace. For the INFP and INTP, the family climate that produces the deepest contracts tends to share something in common. It is not always violent. It is not always cold. Often, it is simply a place where the interior life, the feeling life, the thinking life, the deep private world that is everything to these types, was not met. Not punished necessarily, just not met. The INFP brought feeling into a room that did not know what to do with it. The INTP brought questions into a room that found them inconvenient, and so both learned, quietly, without announcement, to take what was most alive in them somewhere private, somewhere safe, somewhere interior. That turning inward was not weakness, it was intelligence. But it was also the moment the contract began. Here is where the INFP and INTP diverge, because the contracts they signed are different. They share the same origin, a family that could not hold the fullness of who they were, but they wrote different clauses to survive it. The INFP's contract reads, "I will make everything meaningful, so nothing has to be unbearable." This is the vow that runs beneath the INFP's extraordinary capacity for depth, beauty, and emotional richness. They are not simply idealists by nature. They became idealists partly by necessity. When the family was painful, they made it into a story. When the parent was absent, they made the absence into a myth. When the wound was raw, they found the poetry inside it. This is a genuine gift, and it is also a way of never fully arriving at what actually happened. The INTP's contract reads, "I will understand everything, so nothing has to be felt." This is the vow beneath the INTP's extraordinary capacity for analysis, precision, and conceptual mastery. They are not simply thinkers by nature. They became thinkers partly by necessity. When the family was chaotic, they mapped it. When the relationship was painful, they theorized it. When the emotion was too large, they converted it into data and studied it from a safe distance. This is a genuine gift, and it is also a way of staying permanently outside your own life. Both contracts are acts of love toward the self. Both are also forms of slow abandonment. Before they wrote their own contracts, the family assigned them a role. The INFP was often given one of three. Sometimes they became the lost child. the one who disappeared into their own world so quietly that the family forgot to worry about them and called the forgetting harmony. Sometimes they became the sensitive one, praised for their feeling when it served the family's atmosphere, called too much when it didn't. Sometimes they became the idealist martyr, the one who absorbed everyone's pain and transformed it into meaning, carrying the family's unlived emotional life as if it were a vocation. The INTP was given different roles. Sometimes the invisible genius, tolerated, even admired, but never emotionally reached. Their intelligence made them interesting. Their emotional needs made adults uncomfortable. The family learned to engage the mind and ignore the rest. Sometimes the scapegoat, the one whose refusal to perform normal social conformity, became the family's explanation for its own dysfunction. Too strange, too blunt, too honest about things everyone had agreed not to see. Sometimes the emotional exile, not explicitly rejected, but quietly left outside the family's inner circle of warmth. They learned that feelings led nowhere useful and migrated entirely into thought. These roles are not simply memories. They are templates, and the contract you signed to survive them is still running in how you love, how you work, how close you allow people to get, and where you disappear when the world becomes too much. Before we dismantle anything, it is important to say this clearly. The contract worked. The INFP's capacity to transform pain into meaning is not an illusion. It is a genuine psychological achievement. The ability to find beauty in difficulty, to hold complexity with tenderness, to make sense of the senseless. These are not small things. They kept you alive inside environments that might otherwise have crushed the sensitivity that makes you who you are. The INTP's capacity to think through everything is not a failure of feeling. It is a genuine act of intelligence. The ability to map systems, to hold contradictions without collapsing, to understand what others are only reacting to, these are not small things either. They gave you a kind of sovereignty in environments where emotional chaos was the only alternative. Honor this before you try to leave it. The contract was not a mistake. It was an answer to a real problem. The question is only whether the problem still exists, or whether you are still paying for protection you no longer need in a house you left years ago. The contract becomes a prison the moment you can no longer tell the difference between the survival tool and the self. For the INFP, the signal is a particular kind of grief that has no clear object. You mourn relationships that never fully existed as you imagined them. You stay loyal to versions of people that were partly your own creation. You transform disappointment into meaning so quickly that you never fully feel the disappointment itself. And beneath the beauty, beneath the rich interior world, there is sometimes a person who has never allowed the wound to simply be ugly, to be unresolved, unpoetic, and real. The idealization that once protected you now keeps you from landing, from arriving at what is actually there, rather than what you have made of it. For the INTP, the signal is a particular kind of loneliness that analysis cannot solve. You understand your patterns with extraordinary precision. You can describe your attachment style, your family dynamics, your emotional defenses with the clarity of someone who has studied themselves for years. And yet something remains unchanged, because understanding is not the same as healing. The map is not the territory, and you can spend a lifetime cartographing a country you have never once walked through in your body, in the present, with your defenses down. The abstraction that once protected you now keeps you at a permanent distance from your own experience. The moment of recognition. The contract begins to crack, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a small, quiet failure of the mechanism. For the INFP, it is the moment the meaning doesn't come. You reach for the transformation, the reframe, the poetry, the deeper purpose, and it isn't there. What is there instead is just the plain, unbeautified fact of what happened, what was missing, what hurt, what never came, and for a moment, before the mechanism reactivates, you feel it without the story around it. That moment is the beginning. For the INTP, it is the moment the understanding doesn't help. You have mapped the territory completely. You know exactly why you feel what you feel, exactly where it comes from, exactly what psychological mechanism is producing it, and you still feel it. The analysis is complete, and the wound is still open. And for a moment, before you reach for another layer of theory, you realize that knowing and healing are two entirely different countries. That moment is the beginning. Neither of these moments feels like progress. Both feel like failure. The thing that always worked has stopped working. What is actually happening is that the contract is becoming visible, which is the only way it can ever be broken. This is where the INFP and INTP path diverges most clearly from the INFJ and INTJ. The INFJ and INTJ break the family contract by refusing, by stepping outside the role, interrupting the pattern, no longer performing what the system expected. Their individuation is, at its core, an act of refusal. The INFP and INTP break their contract by returning, not returning to the family, returning to themselves, to the parts of the self that were placed into storage when the contract was signed. The INFP must return to the feeling that was never made beautiful, the plain, unnarrated truth of what they experienced. Not to dramatize it, not to transform it, just to let it be what it is, without art and without distance. The INTP must return to the body, to the present moment, to the felt experience of being alive, rather than the observed experience of being alive. Not to analyze the feeling, not to understand where it came from, just to be inside it, without the protection of theory, for long enough that something real moves. This returning is not passive. It is the most difficult thing either type can do. It requires giving up the very gift that has defined them, the meaning-making, the analysis, not forever, but long enough to feel what those gifts were built to protect them from. The price of breaking the contract is the loss of a certain comfort. The INFP loses the story that made everything coherent. For a time, the wound is just a wound. The absent parent is just absent. The childhood is just what it was, without the mythological frame that made it livable. This disorientation is real, and it passes, but it must be passed through, not bypassed. The INTP loses the distance that felt like freedom. For a time, the understanding provides no shelter. What was safely theoretical becomes personal. What was observed becomes felt. This exposure is real, and it passes, but it must be felt, not analyzed away. And the gift, for both, is presence. The INFP, who has returned from idealization, discovers something unexpected. Reality, fully felt and undistorted, is not less beautiful than the story. It is more, because it is true. The depth that was always their gift no longer needs to perform. It can simply be. The INTP, who has returned from abstraction, discovers something unexpected. Being inside your own experience, without the buffer of analysis, is not as dangerous as the contract insisted. The intelligence that was always their gift no longer needs to protect. It can simply think, freely, from a place that is finally whole. So if you are an INFP who has spent years making beauty from pain, who has loved people as they could be more than as they were, who has carried meaning like a duty, who has told yourself the story of your own life so many times that you are no longer sure which version is true. This is not an accusation. It is a recognition. You were brilliant. The contract you signed kept you alive inside a world that didn't know what to do with you. And now you are old enough, strong enough, conscious enough to ask, what would I feel if I stopped narrating it? What would be left if the story fell away. And if you are an INTP who has understood everything and changed less than understanding should allow, who has mapped the wound from every angle and still found yourself living inside it, who has explained yourself to yourself with extraordinary precision and still felt fundamentally unreached. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is the limit of what intelligence was built for. You were brilliant, and now you are being asked to do the one thing your contract never covered, not to think your way home, but to arrive there. The contract ends not when you refuse it. It ends when you no longer need it, when the interior world you built to survive becomes a place you live from rather than a place you hide in, when the meaning you make is chosen rather than compelled, when the understanding you carry serves life rather than shields it. That is not abandonment of who you are. That is who you have always been. Finally, without the contract between you and yourself. If this work speaks to you, there are a few ways to go deeper. The Hidden Chamber is my Substack, where I write essays that go further than what a video can hold. If you want the full psychological depth behind what we explore here, that is where it lives. The link is in the description. If you don't want to miss the next deep dive, subscribe to the channel. Each video in this series goes somewhere the previous one couldn't. And if you want to support this work while getting early access to selected videos before they go public, you can join the membership using the Join button below. It is the most direct way to help this continue. Thank you for being here and for being the kind of person who stays until the end.